Hello, welcome to Actual Spinster. Hope you like the look. My name is Anna Marie. Before I get into the video, I want to say there's like a link in my description box to a GoFundMe to help Alla and her family whilst she's stuck in Gaza, and if you can check that out, please do. Today I wanted to talk about, kind of in honour of Victober, socialist Victorian fiction. It might be a bit of a ramble. I do have some things that I kind of want to cover, and I obviously have some books to talk about specifically. I don't think you should expect this to be super coherent, but hopefully it will still be interesting. It's hard to kind of know where to start because obviously the kind of late Victorian socialist movement doesn't just spring up out of absolutely nowhere. Like, it has some connections with lots of past movements. I obviously have to mention Chartists as one of the kind of first major working class movements in the UK, but Chartism is not the same as socialism, and it's important to recognise that. And then also within the developing socialist kind of movement in, you know, the 1880s into the 1890s, there are lots of different strands of socialism, and there's certainly lots of sort of different motivational and key points that people are organising around or theorising around, or like writing literary and or non-fiction work out of. I don't know if that made any sense, but what I mean to say is, for example, there's such a thing as like Christian socialism, but there's also maybe more of an aesthetic kind of socialism. There's a sort of new life kind of socialism, which is more so about the transformation of your individual behaviour as a form of socialism, and also there's maybe things that are less socialist overall but do have some socialist kind of pockets and socialist people and socialist kind of ideas included in. I'll also try to leave some things like in the description box maybe that will talk about this more if you are interested. Well, and I didn't even mention utopian socialism, but I would say utopian socialism is like connected with new life socialism. And another caveat actually before I keep going is I did make a video a while ago now on books about utopian socialism, and I will be talking about books that I talked about in that video here, but I also will be talking about other books hopefully too. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to make this video, and I know sometimes it means that like I talk about the same books, but it's because they interest me and I want to chat about them, and obviously not everybody has seen all of my videos, so it's like, you know, may as well. In Britain, which is what this is focused on because that's my specialty, like socialism in the late Victorian era to some degree like has a kind of more formalised line of political thought, comes from the sort of new unionism that's what it's called, of the sort of 1880s, where there was more militant strike action, unionisation, and that kind of led into a more like a sort of boom of socialist groups, organisations. Like in 1884 the Social Democratic Federation was founded, and then following on from the growth of those kinds of groups, they also produced their own periodicals, and then other kinds of movements as well that were not just about reading but were about like living and changing and educating people, which was a major strand, education and the sort of conversion of other people to socialism kind of developed. So that included things like the Labour Church and their socialist like Sunday schools. There's a specific movement around that, and then yeah, within these periodicals there's a lot of like text being produced, and like part of that does go hand in hand with the sort of lessening of taxation on paper and the machinery used to manufacture print culture being like easy and more readily available. I mean, there are still difficulties with keeping going quite a few of the like organs of various socialist groups because they were often strapped for cash, but because like obviously they aren't the mainstream press, so they might be relying on like one person. So for example, like William Morris gave loads of money to Commonweal, which was the organ of his socialist league, for the first, I don't know, like 5 years. He was like basically financing it and also editing it, I think, and blah blah blah. Yeah, I say that all because I think it's good to have the context that print culture is really vital in socialist development and socialist work at that time. And even if the different kind of strands maybe consider things differently, take different priorities as their sort of organising mode, and definitely also have different like class relations and blah blah blah. I would say that like something that kind of characterises basically all of like socialist stuff is an insistence on the value and the deep importance of the written word and of reading as a way to develop into a socialist, and not just non-fictional reading, so you know, like reading journalism or reading I don't know, poetry or whatever, but also reading fiction, and specifically like novels, you know, fables, fairy tales that were being published. And I lost what I was saying, but yeah, with that in mind, I thought I would talk a bit about some of the books that were maybe not always explicitly, but were clearly part of the sort of socialist impulse to educate the proletarian. And also, like, some of these, especially in terms of women, there was a lot of focus on educating middle class women to become socialists, so basically they would get out of the way. Well, there's obviously a marginalisation of women within socialism and their voices and their own political positioning too, as not only people who experience class violence but also patriarchal violence. I'm trying to figure out how to talk about this. Amongst the writing that women write for other women, a lot of them, like I said, were focused on the middle class reader who they could like get to come to the side of socialism. And although I guess that's not like sort of totally useless, the fact that it was so proliferated and there isn't enough focus on working class women being the reader or the politically active person is, you know, a real shame, and I think attenuates the women focused part of socialist organising. But that's not to say that there weren't pockets that were treating working class women with agency and were trying to encourage them to get involved and or facilitating their involvement. It's just that I would say the trend, and also a lot of the women who were actively writing for like the socialist press and or just like publishing novels and things, they often were middle class. There is quite a lot of range, I would say, in what that means, especially in terms of people's relationship specifically to work. But for now, let's not go into that, because it's true that it's a general trend. So I'll start by talking about the book that was published the earliest in this list. Obviously, like, I haven't read everything. There's lots of things I still want to read, blah, blah. But this was published in 1888, and it's A City Girl by Margaret Harkness. The reason why this novel is actually famous, or novella, it's very short, is because Engels, as in Marx and Engels, he wrote a letter where he talked to the author of this, and in it he wrote a sort of criticism of the novel, but also he spoke directly to realism as a category of fiction and the representation of the working class, and what makes a book realist or not. So it's sort of famous like sideways through that, and I don't feel like a lot of the people who referenced that letter necessarily have read the book. I mean, it's not incredible, but like I do feel like that's a shame. So A City Girl tells the story of Nellie Ambrose, and it's like, I guess, in the genre of like the slum novel, where it's set in the East End and it follows this woman and something bad happens to her. She falls in love and then is betrayed basically by this middle class horrible man who I think he does have something to do with healthcare, but I can't remember now. And on the back it just says he's a bureaucrat, but I really did think he was like involved in hospital stuff, because I think there's a scene where he's involved in hospital stuff. I suppose I think the important part of this story, as opposed to it just being kind of a rote retelling of the very tropey sort of like woman is seduced by man, has a baby, is left for dead, or whatever, you know, is that she finds the Salvation Army and they help her. It's pretty rough at times. But the Salvation Army are a kind of like interesting organisation, shall we say. I'm not a historian of the Salvation Army, so I perhaps might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that they grew out of a need to respond to the dire poverty that was being evidenced in the Victorian era, obviously like sort of industrialization and the city, and yeah, the sort of problem of London's poor becomes ever more pressing, I guess, for people as the Victorian era goes on. And I don't know exactly when the Salvation Army was formed. I feel like maybe like 1870s, but I could be completely wrong. But as you might get from the idea, like the Salvation Army is a kind of missionizing project in terms of feeding the poor, yes, but also ensuring that they get the Bible. It's a Christian project to proselytize, and there's a quote that someone talks about them saying like where they got much Bible and little bread. I can't remember what that's from, but that I feel like maybe sums up some of the energy. I mean, Margaret Harkness, I think specifically, she was interested. I wouldn't say, I don't think she was actually directly involved in the Salvation Army, but she was interested in them. I know she wrote another book, In Darkest London, I think is the one I'm thinking of, where she returns to one of the characters who is in here and is part of the Salvation Army and who helps Nellie out. And so obviously she was interested in the work that they were doing. I would say I think this novel is interesting if you are just like interested in the representation of working class women, and if you are interested in the Salvation Army and like the representation thereof. I like open the final page and I've written a note that says, on the final page it gets interesting. Yeah, I think that there's a sense of arrested possibility in this. So another book that I wanted to talk about is, of course, News from Nowhere by William Morris, which is, I think, his most famous fictional work. He wrote like a lot of stuff though, and a lot of it was published in the socialist press. Some of it was published, like he wrote some short stories that were published in Justice, which is the organ of the Social Democratic Federation, but then he split from Justice, and that's when he created the Socialist League. So then a lot of the rest of his work, including News from Nowhere, was published in the organ for the Socialist League, Commonweal. And so News from Nowhere was published in 1890. I can't remember if it was serialised in 1890 or if it was serialised slightly before that, but around then is when it was published. Maybe you know the story, but basically it follows the adventures of a man. He's called William Guest, isn't he? Who basically wakes up in the year 2000. Yeah, he's shown around by the people who live there, and they show him like how great life is, what's changed. Parliament is now a dung heap, and then he meets this elder person who basically tells him the history of the 20th century and how they got to this utopian place. And obviously William Morris is like very well known for his arts and crafts movement, for his insistence that beauty and utility are like both important, and that like being able to create beautiful things is a vital part of like human life. I think his like aesthetification of liberation is a problem for the novel, in the sense that we get told that like the women are very beautiful because they don't have to work anymore. But also women still do work, but like it's because the ravages of capitalism haven't ravaged them, so instead they're exceptionally beautiful and they all look so young. But of course he still, like the main character of course still falls in love with the youngest woman that he meets, so yeah, great one. And we're told that they don't need birth control because like they love it, they just love not having birth control. Like I read this a while ago, so the sort of specifics of it are maybe not totally here with me, but I do just remember a lot of that stuff because it was deeply annoying. But it's certainly a very interesting look at the utopian kind of imaginings that were going on, and yeah, the kinds of worlds that socialists were like aiming towards. For William Morris, his particular kind of dislike of the political establishment in terms of like thinking about Parliament, also like and in terms of what like it being a dung heap as this kind of joke in the book, like also kind of demonstrates his own political stance, and also why he split from, or one of the reasons why he split from the SDF and disagreed with their political program, which focused a lot on electoralism. I don't think it's true to say that explicit politics in novels always make the novels suffer as novels, but I do think that because novels as a form are an already explicitly politicized form, and they come out of like a bourgeois tradition that does things like separates the private from the public, that demonstrates a particular kind of gender role and conservatism, and also that plots end, so you have to end them, and then that has particular consequences, like including, you know, like a marriage plot ending in a marriage, because I think that is like a political statement in terms of the position of women especially, but also in terms of just like, if you're writing a story about a revolution, for example, like when you end your book tells you a lot about the revolution. I suppose that seems maybe like a silly thing to say, but I just think the use of the novel is like fraught, but it's still very interesting, and obviously people are very drawn to it as a form, and like they really like it. And obviously, you know, sometimes the serialization of novels like maybe changes them and like blah blah, but not to the degree that the political conceits are like completely gone. I mean, I think that the timing of a serialized piece of fiction can be very interesting and like can make more meaning. So what I guess I mean by that is, like, if you are reading like a chapter from a book about the future where it's utopian, and you're reading that in a newspaper that is covering the current strike wave that is going on, the feeling that you would experience from that reading and from reading those two things together, or like through at the same time, is different than if you just read the whole book in one go. I think we'll just move on. Thanks, William. Next, I guess I want to talk about some of the books I already have spoken about because I wrote my master's dissertation on them. But I guess before I do, I want to briefly speak to this idea of like the new woman, which if you haven't heard anything about this, academics like to say that there's a particular kind of fiction that is being published that is the new woman novel, and they have liked to say that for a while, for like 25 years, I don't know. In the 1990s was when it was first kind of returned to, because a lot of like women's voices were being recovered, or at least like focused on in a way that they hadn't been before. And so like Anne Ardis, for example, is famous for her work on that, and I wouldn't like wholly disagree, but I do think that that has led people to believe and to imagine that the new woman was a positive figure for modern women, and also was way more cohesively drawn and used as a form of sort of like feminist or proto-feminist movement building. There wasn't a new woman movement. What there were obviously was like nascent women's movements, women's organising, and obviously also from the sort of history of the 20th century, or like into the 20th century, we get further and closer to the enfranchisement of women. There's a kind of self-consciousness of women's position from women that is, I would say, developing, but it's also it's not a clear line, and obviously there's lots of different things, and like women have very different loyalties. Like they are not all connected via their gender in a way that in the way that is suggested maybe by talking about these things as new women novels. It's okay to call them that, like it's fine, it's obviously easy to have a shorthand, but I just think that it has led to a kind of sense of like the new woman's importance in a way that actually isn't really necessarily that true. And I also think it has led for a lot of novels where like these writers are writing about what it means to be a woman to be kind of pigeonholed as new women novels, when really like writing about a woman doesn't mean that you're writing about them in a particular way. I kind of maybe should make a video about this separately, I guess, because I have a lot to say, but I do think, I'll try to say one more thing, which is just that I do think that it also has led to the obfuscation of various different sort of axes or frameworks that are present in these novels, that are about gender in more than just the new woman way, but also are about class or imperialism or eugenics, and people don't want to focus on that as much as they should, or don't want it to be as present and as kind of explicit as some of that is, because they kind of like identify with a particular form of like proto-feminism, and they want these new women, or the new woman, to be a kind of like legacy figure that leads into the suffragette, which leads into the modern day liberated woman, which like isn't inherently bad, but it's just like that legacy is not clear of the deep and binding commitments of imperialism, and is not part of a history of eugenics or class exploitation. There's definitely a sort of like divide going on where it's like, let's examine what it means to be a woman and go to work, when women have been working paid and unpaid, but paid for hundreds of years already. Like, it's not new for women to be working. It is new for like some particularly like high-classed women to be working, but yeah, hope that makes sense. Sorry for rambling on. So with that in mind, I guess I say this because I want to talk about some novels that I think people could call the New Woman novel, but I think that that is a way of kind of flattening them a bit, and I definitely have called them New Woman novels before, but having done more reading and thinking, I just feel like, you know, whatever. Okay, so first we have On the Threshold by Isabella Ford. So On the Threshold is a novel about two like art students. I think one is maybe a music student, the other's an art student, can't quite remember. Kitty and Lucretia, and they moved to London and they live together and they are socialists. And it's just like about whether it's sort of possible for them. There's a lot of interesting and explicit conversations about socialism and about alternative ways of living. This, I would say, is about new life socialism. It has like a middle class current in how it approaches socialist living, precisely because it's focused on how people live as opposed to dismantling the class system itself. In this novel too, there is also like a sense of kind of arrested development, I guess, in terms of like these women, young women who want to find their place in the world and who want to like make space for themselves, but like kind of struggle to do that. And the main character whose perspective it's written from, she definitely has like gay vibes, which is interesting, and especially because Isabella Ford, she was like so spinster, gay energy. But another major strand of this, sorry, I'm doing a really bad job talking about it, but I'm just chatting, I guess. Is whether like working class women and middle class women can work together and can be in solidarity with each other. It actually, when I was looking at it yesterday, when I got it back out the library, it interested me because it starts with this first line: Beatrice Ratcliffe was the name of the maid of all work in our London lodgings. It just really interested me that that's where it begins. I don't think that is where the novel ends, but Beatrice is a really important character in this, and she is a maid of all work, and she does demonstrate the proximity to sex work, for example, that working class women were living inside of, and that really interests me because it's also like, obviously being a maid of all work is like a particular kind of title in terms of like being in someone's home. It means that you do all of the work there. It's not like you have like a scullery maid who does stuff in the scullery and then you have someone who does this. No, it's like the maid of all work does all of it. But then actually, if you're a maid of all work, that also has the implication that you do other forms of work too, which would include sex work. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the discussion that Isabella Ford is trying to have. I think she's more focusing on Beatrice as a representative of working class women who they try to, like these two middle class women try to make good and work well, but it's there. And I think that's also what I would say about, I mean, I think this is true of reading almost all books, but obviously you can kind of read with the grain, against the grain, but it's also just that like within books people sometimes put things that they don't mean to, but that are like very telling about how they imagine like the state of the world, or what they believe women to be like, or yeah, what they think justice actually looks like, or how they are even imagining a different world. And so that's very interesting to me, and it can be super like kind of delightful to like hold on to that and to like unpack a book in a way that gives you a real sense of that and like a groundedness in that too. And then yeah, I don't know. Then we have this, which is The Girl from the Farm. I think this one probably more so than On the Threshold is sort of a critique of the New Woman novel from the perspective of a socialist woman. And I think Gertrude Dix's other book, The Image Breakers, which like I said I have talked about on this channel before, is also that more so, but also they're socialist women talking about what it's like to be a socialist woman, maybe not so much in this one, but in The Image Breakers definitely, and obviously in On the Threshold. And like, I don't think that socialist women neatly fall into the New Woman category for various different reasons. So, but yeah, so The Girl from the Farm is about a woman and her family, and like her brother meets this working class girl and she gets pregnant, and then, but like she's not the focus of the story even though it's about the girl from the farm. Instead, the main character really is the sister of that brother who finds this out, and then basically is just like appalled by the double standards, the moral cowardice of like the community, her parents and her brother. I think it's her brother. And so, yeah, it's about her relationship, sort of, with the girl from the farm. His name, I don't remember. Do we ever actually find it out? I feel like maybe we don't. So this definitely has a lot of issues, even if it is maybe more of a critique on class lines with other new women fiction, but it's also it still does a lot of the same kind of privileging that goes on in, like, yeah, other novels. I'm going to tell you what happens at the end, so like skip ahead for like 30 seconds if you don't want to know that. Or like when I've stopped holding this up, I won't be talking about it anymore. But basically, like, this ends with Catherine, I think is the name of the middle class woman, and she like goes to London to stay like with the girl from the farm. She goes to London to stay with her friend Mary Field, who is like a modern woman, but like it's so funny that she's called Mary Field because like I'm pretty sure that's like a reference to Michael Field, and like Gertrude Dix does love her names to be like meaningful. So I think so. I could be wrong, because now maybe Michael Field wasn't like, but I think 1880s and 1890s was when Michael Field was like in the zeitgeist. So yeah, but anyway, and like it a bit like On the Threshold, it also does have like gay energy and gay potential. My phone died, so yeah, hopefully you're not in too different of a position. I don't really feel like talking about The Image Breakers much, but it is a really interesting novel, and I think it's definitely less clumsy than The Girl on the Farm. I would recommend it, but it's only available online as far as I can tell. It's such a shame. Like, I really wish it had a modern edition. Broadview, if you want me to do that, let me know. Yeah, it tells like a kind of double plot, although there is a main character, I would say, about Leslie Ardent, who's a girl from Bristol, basically. Pretty sure it's Bristol. I don't think it's ever actually said, but it's based off of like Gertrude Dix's own story, who gets involved in socialism, and then she moves to London and then is like working and blah blah blah. Very terrible way to sum it up. But then yeah, there's also Rosalind Dangerfield, who's the wife of a mill owner or like a factory owner. I can't remember quite what he does. He's definitely a capitalist, and she also gets radicalized by socialism. And then we follow her story too, where she also goes to London, but she lives in a free love union with a socialist man. For both of them, it's very interesting in terms of their relationships with people. I think also like a major current for the writing of socialist women about the experiences and position of socialist women is a kind of ambivalence. So they both have a sense of, in fact, I mean, Isabella Ford too, and Gertrude Dix's books, they have these senses of utopianism. They have the sense of like hopefulness, and sometimes they even show people like living differently together, and also explicitly talking about like how they would rearrange life so that it was more equitable. But they also have a current of kind of pessimism that goes through them too, in terms of especially the relationship of women to men and how men treat women, and I suppose even more so than that too, sometimes maybe out of censorship, but also just in general, the plot sometimes demonstrates that ambivalence, or like demonstrates those failings. The role of marriage and the free love union is very interesting, and The Image Breakers is a really interesting novel, definitely. I do just wish it was like available much more easily to read. Like, you can read it online, it's on Hallie Trust. I'll see if I can put a link to it, but it's not a very nice way to read a book, I feel. But yeah. The next book is Seaweed by Edith Ellis. And Edith is like famous for being the wife of Havelock Ellis, and also for being used as some of his work on sexology, because she was like queer. Seaweed is an interesting novel, especially if you've read D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lava. I mean, it came up before that novel did, and like I don't know if you could argue that he had read it, but it feels very like he must have. But if he did, he also completely stripped the class critique of the book out of his own book, basically. But basically, yes, this is about a couple. The man in the couple has had a accident. I think he's a miner. I think it's set in the south. I think it's set in Cornwall, maybe. I think his name is Kit. Like Seaweed did actually come out in different editions, and I think it was also a play, but I couldn't find that edition of it. It was also called Kit's Woman, I think. Anyway, so Seaweed follows this man who has been injured, and so he can't like have children. like in a mining accident. He has a wife whose name I cannot remember, but I'm pretty sure she's like from Lancashire. Like it's a point of frustration for the people around her that she's not from the south, like she came down. And then it basically follows like Kit's kind of desire to free her from the bond of loyalty in their marriage in terms of sex, because he thinks that she should have a child. And it's just very interesting because it does kind of think more explicitly about sexual morality, sexuality, and I guess the sort of double standard that is present in a lot, like in, you know, if we think back to A City Girl, where it's this middle class man, he's married and he has an affair with Nellie. Like we get the inverse of that, where the woman is married and she's having an affair with a man, and then she is also allowed to do that, but she's having an affair before Kit allows her to do that too. So she has a lot of agency. I mean, you know, of course it's interesting too because he is disabled, and that's like a major aspect of it, which of course is also like a major aspect of Lady Chatterley's lover. Okay, full disclosure, I have not read all of that because I started reading it and I fucking hated it, and I don't like D.H. Lawrence, and I was also, like I said, just like very frustrated that he clearly stripped so much from like a story that could have been very interesting because of the way that he positioned his characters in terms of class. Seaweed just leaves a lot to think about, and like the way it's considered and positioned by some scholars, particularly one of my favourites, Elizabeth Carolyn Miller, is as a book that is both modernist but also keeps the like socialist criticism that has been developing in terms of personal relationships. Whereas like if we kind of chart from the late Victorian era into the 1920s and thinking about modernism, where the focus is super directly on the individual body and that as like a place of censorship, whereas before, marriage has been what has been being critiqued, both from a liberal perspective in terms of just like women in general, but also from a specifically socialist perspective where, for example, like being married is kind of seen as something that is antithetical to being a socialist by some groups, obviously not all of them, because it's about ownership. It would be like saying you're a socialist and a landowner. Of course some people were and said that too. I hope that makes sense. There's a kind of strand of socialists who did believe in free love, which is to say that they did not believe in marriage and they wanted to be in unions with people that were not bound legally, and they saw marriage as a form of, some of them I guess saw marriage as a form of prostitution, and certainly that's how some of the women are writing about marriage too, in their works, but also just as a form of ownership that is against communism. And then the final novel I wanted to talk about is one that I finished really recently, and I'd like recommend it so much to people because like I've been saying that like these books are kind of gay, and I stand by that statement, but this book is the most gay I think I've ever read for a Victorian novel. I'm just thinking if that's true, but I think it's true. I mean, obviously Villette has that like really gay scene, but yeah, I think this is the most gay I've ever read. And it's called Aimée Furniss, Scholar. It's by Catherine Bruce Glaser. It was published in 1896, and it's great. So it's about this school teacher called Aimée Furniss. It's a pretty short novel as well, like most of these. I guess the image break is the one that like stands out as the longest. So part of me does want to talk about like what makes the story so gay, but I think first of all I'll maybe try to talk a bit more about the plot. So the story begins actually with like a very upsetting moment where a woman outside of Amy's window basically is hurt by her husband, who's drunk, and so Amy rushes out to help her. The husband runs away. She brings her in, she's pregnant, and then they call a doctor, and she dies. Her child dies as well, and so does she. She is married, but like they're tramping is what they call it, which actually if you've read the Five you will have learned about that practice, and I thought that was really interesting to read it being explicitly talked about in this book. I did not like the Five, but it does talk about that. And that's kind of like the catalyst for Amy trying to figure out like the world, like her worldview and like what she can do to make suffering less, basically. And you know, it's sort of like in the title that she's a scholar, but what is she a scholar of really? It's actually that she's like educating herself about socialism basically, but by the end there's also this woman in who's part of the community, and she's like a shop girl, and then she is like basically taken advantage of by this higher class man, who's like the son of some, you know, wealthy and important people in town, and I mean, she believes that he loves her and is very sad. It's a brief look in, because it's like basically, I think it goes over like 2 years, and so we kind of follow Aimée Furniss's development. There's also this curate who has arrived. Yeah, it actually really annoyed me when I read some scholar talking about this, because they say he's a Catholic priest, which is not true. The whole point is that he is not, and he like refuses the vows and stuff. Just really annoyed me, because like specifically that's like an important plot point that he's not, like, but he is part of, I guess, like a Catholic church, although I'm not entirely sure, but certainly like a very stringent church that's very into suffering. But also, this is definitely a book that's very much about Christian socialism. Mr. Howardson is the name of the curate, and he like has like a working boys club where like he teaches them songs, and they do like gymnastics and like athletics and stuff like that, and he just teaches them stuff too. Okay, I'm going to talk about like the ending, so if you don't want to know, skip ahead a little bit. Basically, it ends by Aimée and Annie, who's the name of the woman who was like mistreated by the horrible man, like pledging themselves to each other in a marriage ceremony, but like it's a folk custom marriage ceremony. There's this sort of like folk tale where like if you go and you drink water out of each other's hands at like this particular quarry, then you'll be bonded together forever, and like if you try to break that and marry someone else, like it won't work. So there's that like folk custom, and so like Annie and Aimée do that. Like, that's so gay. But then what we also get a glimpse of at the end as well is that like Aimée and Annie, they go away because Annie is pregnant from her interaction with Bertie, so she can't have the baby in the village because they'll treat her badly. So they go away for a year and they bring up this baby together, and like it's also very gay too, and they create this kind of family there. But they also change the area that they go to, because like Mr. Howardson lends Aimée some like socialist literature to like spread out and share, and then it ends with him coming to that town or village, I can't remember, and giving like a speech about basically like the Labour Church, and it's like a sermon, but he's obviously a socialist. And so yeah, it's just like very interesting. But then also what is like possibly going to happen, like it doesn't happen on page, but like it's highly insinuated that Aimée and Mr. Howardson are gonna get together, like they're gonna get married. But yeah, it's very interesting. But like that Annie and her baby as well are like part of that future together too, so it is kind of like a throuple, sort of polyamorous. But yeah, very interesting. I feel like this novel both kind of speaks to free love unions, but also kind of avoids that by having it all end up in marriage, and having Aimée be so kind of morally upright. I think I've run out of things to say that are coherent, so I guess we'll stop there. I hope that this was interesting. Definitely let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you're interested in reading any of these books. If you want the PDF of Aimée Furniss Scholar, let me know, or I can send you a link to where you can download it from the library. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about today. I hope it is, because I talked so much. I hope that you are having a good day when you're watching this. I hope you're having a good victober if you're participating. You know, if you want to pick up some socialist Victorian fiction this year, definitely go for it. Yeah, cool. Okay, I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye.